Hi, I'm Julia Olson. I'm the executive director of our Children's Trust, and I'm also co-lead counsel in what we hope will be the landmark lawsuit called Juliana versus the United States. And this lecture is part of Oregon State University's Bedrock Lecture series on human rights and climate change. And it's an honor to be a part of this. My organization that I founded in 2010, our Children's Trust, is based on two founding guiding principles. One, that we will advocate on behalf of young people and future generations to protect their fundamental legal rights to a healthy atmosphere and a stable climate system. And that when we are doing that, we will work with the best available science to secure legal remedies that are enforceable and binding and based on the science of actually protecting and stabilizing the climate for not just this generation, but all future generations. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means as I get into describing the case. So Juliana versus United States is one of our cases. We work to support youth in bringing legal actions against their governments all over the world and across the United States. Juliana versus the United States is one of the biggest cases because it's going after the United States federal government and its decades of infringing on the fundamental rights of young people. So the claims in the case are based on the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which secures individuals their rights to life, liberty, and property. And it also forms the basis for the public trust rights that citizens in the United States and indeed in countries around the world hold. And I'll start with public trust. Public trust comes from a doctrine that goes back to Roman times, and it's based on the foundational principle that all governments are trustees over essential, vital natural resources that we all hold in common. We share them. And the government acts as the ultimate protector of those resources so that they're there for the use and enjoyment and benefit of all future generations. So it's really an intergenerational justice and human rights principle of law that has roots in religions around the world, it has roots in indigenous traditions and cultures, and it's rooted in common law and civil law of countries everywhere. And in the U.S. Constitution, the court has found that the public trust doctrine, as it applies to our federal government, is rooted in the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. We also think it's rooted in the Posterity Clause, which starts our Constitution and says that we will protect and secure our liberties, not just for ourselves, but for our posterity as well. The Fifth Amendment substantive due process claim that is part of Juliana is really important and interesting. And what we're doing is really taking these deeply rooted principles of law that have been with our nation since the founding, that government can't deprive you of your personal security, government can't deprive you of your life, government can't deprive you of many of your other liberties or your property. And in the case of climate change, the United States government has knowingly, for 50 years or more, acted in a way to create an energy system for our country that was grounded in the use and burning of fossil fuels. And they've known for over half a century that by doing so, it actually was endangering all future generations with catastrophic sea level rise and temperature increases that would cause all kinds of havoc and degradation to natural systems and actually harm to humans and the rights of people. And yet, even with recommendations, to our federal government, within government, by experts for decades, that the country needed to transition to a clean energy system, and that renewable energy was actually possible and needed to be invested in and researched and chosen over fossil fuels. The United States government continued to prefer and choose fossil fuels over other forms of energy, so that today 80% of the US energy supply still comes from fossil fuels. So we're challenging those affirmative acts of the United States government to authorize that kind of energy system and promote it and subsidize it and support it for so long, to the catastrophic consequences to young people and harm to their liberties that are happening today. And in this case, I have the privilege of representing 21 amazing young people from all over the country. They're diverse in many ways, and they represent different stories of American young people and what they face today from these actions of the federal government and the injuries that they're already experiencing and that will worsen over time as they grow up. And I'll just share a couple of their stories, although each of them have stories, both in terms of the ways in which they're being impacted, and also the ways in which they're taking action in their democracy to be truly engaged citizens to change the course of history. Levi has a story that is tragic. Levi lives on a barrier island off of the eastern coast of Florida, and his home is at 3 feet above sea level right now. But that's drastically changing. So sea level rise is increasing across the world. Florida is particularly vulnerable, and barrier islands are the most vulnerable, similar to what the island nations of the world face. And so Levi is already experiencing the severe consequences of the increased intensity of storms, like Hurricane Irma, for example. Levi's had to evacuate his home numerous times. He still can't go back to his school because of the impact from the storms in 2017 that flooded and shut down his school. And Levi is only 10. And so the emotional consequences of these physical impacts of climate change and the fear of living in a place that he knows within his young lifetime will be submerged by the sea if governments don't act swiftly to reduce emissions. That's hugely consequential for a young child. And I also tell the story of Jacob and Sahara and Avery and Zealand and some of our Oregon-based plaintiffs, and also the story of Aji, who's based in Seattle, Washington. So these plaintiffs are experiencing numerous different types of impacts, but one of the impacts that we're seeing increase is the incidence of wildfires. And in the West, the number of days that we now experience wildfires has increased substantially. And the severity of those fires is also increasing with drought conditions. And last summer, many of these young people experienced days and days and weeks of unhealthy, hazardous air quality conditions where they couldn't go outside and play. And that has been a huge impact on many of their lives, including some of them who experience asthmatic conditions, where it actually jeopardizes their physical health. Aji lost a week of school because of the air quality conditions in Seattle. Our Eugene, Oregon plaintiffs also have been impacted in being restricted in activities they're allowed to do while at school, like not going outside. And these conditions we're going to see worsen. This winter, we're again having a very low snowpack year in the West, which is going to further exacerbate the conditions around wildfires and impact these young people individually. For Jacob, he lives on a farm in southern Oregon, and the drought conditions not only threaten his farm and the structures of their home and their property with wildfire, but the air quality makes it difficult to work on the farm in the summer, and the drought conditions have limited and reduced the availability of water. Many of the trees and the surrounding forests on Jacob's land they've preserved for habitat, the trees are dying. So these are just some of the stories that these young people bring to this case. And what they're seeking is not money, not damages. They're seeking a comprehensive plan, we call it a climate recovery plan, by the United States government to transition the nation's energy system completely away from fossil fuels, roughly by mid-century, and to a clean energy system in all sectors, and that the emission reductions that are mandated, we hope by the court, will require swift emission reductions in line with the scientific prescription of returning carbon dioxide levels to 350 parts per million by 2100 as a maximum threshold. And by doing that, what scientists say is that would allow for the temperature increases over pre-industrial levels to stabilize at 1 degree Celsius, which is what we're at right now. There would be a slight overshoot on the way there, but then a stabilization back at safe levels or safer levels. But long term, what many scientists say is that we really need to go back to levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide that are closer to where we were at before the Industrial Revolution, if we really want to preserve our ice sheets and stop the levels of sea level rise that are projected for the future. And so this gets back to one of our Children's Trust's founding principles, is that nature's laws and the laws of science and the best science we have available to us today on climate change and its impacts really need to be the foundation of policies, of judicial decisions, that we can't let political feasibility come in and dictate the standards that are set or where we're headed in terms of an energy transition. Because if we do it too slowly, there is such a thing as being too late in the context of the climate crisis. So another topic that we address in this case, because we work with young people, is the clear discrimination that is being waged against young people, children, as a class, that differs from the impacts that other generations and other people will experience. Because children are developing and they're more sensitive to changes in environmental impact, because they're so impacted in terms of their emotional and mental well-being, they're more susceptible to some of the infectious disease and asthmatic conditions that are exacerbated with climate change. They really do have unique impacts that other people don't typically have. And of course, they will live much longer than adults living today. And children don't have political power. They don't have the ability to vote. They don't have the ability to elect leaders to make the right decisions on their behalf. And in this work, we really look to other social justice movements. We look to other constitutional cases to inform our work. And so I just wanted to tell a brief story about Polly Murray, who was a law student in 1944 at Howard University. And she was the only woman in her class, an African-American woman. She graduated first in her class. And in 1944, she was with her professor and her classmates, and they were talking about the efforts that had been made to challenge the equal part of separate but equal that arose out of Plessy versus Ferguson, a Supreme Court decision that said that you could still protect the rights of African American citizens by creating equal facilities like schools, even if they were separate from the white population. And the efforts to create equal facilities and schools and public services had completely failed. And Polly was in the class and she raised the issue of, well, why aren't we challenging the separate part of Plessy versus Ferguson? And she was apparently laughed out of her class. And she was a strong woman and she persevered and she made her argument. And she stood up and she bet her law school professor that within 25 years, Plessy versus Ferguson would be overturned. And this was in 1944. She wrote a law review article that went on to explain her theory of overturning the separate part of Plessy versus Ferguson under the 14th Amendment, which is the state equivalent of the Fifth Amendment, which applies against the federal government. And her law professor went on to assist Thurgood Marshall in Brown versus Board of Education and used Polly's work to develop the legal theory that young African American children then brought to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson successfully in 1954. So within 10 years, a legal theory that was literally laughed at by an innovative young law student became the law of the land within 10 years. And so there are moments in history and in legal work where the need to protect human rights, the need to protect civil rights, makes us look at the purpose of the law and how it's being used and how we can approach it from a way and a perspective that is just and looks at something outside the box and creatively. So it's what we're trying to do here with Juliana, is really get to the foundation of what are we supposed to be doing for these young people and these children, and what is our democracy about? And so I wanted to read a couple of things that we have found that I think speaks to this issue of human rights and climate change. So starting in 1909, the presidents of the United States started holding decadal conferences on the rights of children. And President Teddy Roosevelt in 1909 addressed Congress, and he said, "It is high time to realize that our responsibility to the coming millions is like that of parents to their children, and that in wasting our resources, we are wronging our descendants. The function of our government is to ensure to all its citizens, now and hereafter, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we of this generation destroy the resources from which our children would otherwise derive their livelihood, we reduce the capacity of our land to support a population, and so either degrade the standard of living or deprive the coming generations of their right to life on this continent. If we allow great industrial organizations to exercise unregulated control of the means of production and the necessaries of life, we deprive Americans of today and of the future of industrial liberty, a right no less precious and vital than political freedom." And then President Herbert Hoover in 1929 at the White House Child Conference Planning Committee, he spoke and said, "I need not urge upon you the fundamental importance of this undertaking. The greatest asset of a race is its children, that their bodily strength and development should prepare them to receive the heritage which each generation must bequeath to the next. These questions have the widest of social importance that reaches to the roots of democracy itself. By the safeguard of health and protection of childhood, we further contribute to that equality of opportunity, which is the unique basis of American civilization. And I just want to close with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939 at the White House Conference on Children and Democracy. Definitely, we are here with a principal objective of considering the relationship between a successful democracy and the children who form an integral part of that democracy. We no longer set them apart from democracy as if they were a segregated group. They are at one with democracy because they are dependent upon democracy, and democracy is dependent upon them. Thanks so much for listening, and follow Juliana versus US at youthvgov.org or ourchildrenstrust.org. Thank you.